The first thing I saw that Saturday morning was a yellow school bus parked across my cattle-guard. The second was a hand-painted plywood sign that said, "Buy raw wood, harvest fair," with an arrow pointing straight through my front gate. And the third was Marlene Vickers, president of the Briarwood Landing Property Association, standing on the bed of a borrowed pickup truck and telling 200 strangers that my late husband's pasture had finally been returned to the community. Now, I had been awake maybe 6 minutes, still wearing my house slippers, coffee cooling in my hand. And for a second, I honestly thought I was having one of those dreams that makes no sense until you wake up and remember you ate chili too late the night before. But no, there it was, plain as a church bell on Sunday morning. Minivans parked in my hayfield, children chasing each other between my fence posts, folding tables full of pies and crock pots sitting where my cattle had been grazing the evening before. Somebody had hung orange streamers from the old walnut tree beside my barn, and a man I had never met in my life was trying to plug a cassette deck into an extension cord running from my pump house. I stood there in the kitchen window, looking out over land my husband, Frank, and I had worked for 32 years, and I felt something settle in my chest. It was not rage exactly. Rage is hot and messy. It makes you say foolish things and throw good plates of bad people. What I felt was colder than that. It was the feeling you get when somebody has walked into your home, put their boots on your table, and smiled while doing it. My name is Judith Ralston, though most people around Larkinsville, Missouri have called me Jude since I was 14 years old. In the fall of 1995, I was 56, widowed for just under 3 years, living alone on 168 acres of pasture, creek bottom, and old oak woods a few miles north of Truman Lake. The place had belonged to Frank's family since before the county paved the road out front, before television antennas started showing up on rooftops, before anybody in town had heard the phrase property association. We called it Ralston Hollow because it sat low between two ridges, with a spring-fed creek running through the middle and enough grass to keep a modest herd of cattle fed through most summers. It was not fancy. The farmhouse leaned a little to the left because the foundation had settled sometime around the Eisenhower administration. The porch steps squeaked no matter how many times Frank fixed them, and the barn roof looked like it had fought the weather for 50 years and lost several rounds. But it was ours, or at least after Frank passed, it was mine. And that mattered more to me than I could explain to somebody like Marlene Vickers. Marlene had moved into Briarwood Landing 4 years earlier when the developer put up 42 brick ranch houses along the ridge east of my pasture. She had come from St. Louis, or maybe Kansas City, depending on which version of her life she was telling that day. She had bright blonde hair that never moved in the wind, wore loafers in places where decent people wore boots, and carried a leather clipboard like it was a badge from the federal government. She had been a real estate agent once, and you could tell because she spoke about everything in terms of potential. A field was not a field, it was open green space. A creek was not a creek, it was a natural water feature. A fence was not a fence, it was a visual barrier. And my cattle were not cattle, they were a liability concern. The first time she came to my door, she smiled so hard I thought her face might crack. She told me Briarwood Landing was forming a neighborhood association and wanted all adjacent property owners to participate in preserving the quality of life in the area. I told her I had lived next to that area long before it had a name, a brick entrance sign, or a monthly dues bill. She laughed as though I had made a joke, then handed me a folder full of rules about lawn height, exterior paint colors, pet restrictions, and approved mailbox styles. I looked through it for a moment, then asked her where the page was about feeding cows in February. She blinked at me. I said, "Marlene, I am not joining your association." Her smile got smaller. "Mrs. Ralston, this is about protecting property values," I said. "Then I suggest you protect yours, and I will protect mine." That should have been the end of it, but people like Marlene did not really hear the word no. They hear it as a temporary inconvenience, something to be discussed, managed, negotiated, worn down over coffee and committees until the person saying it gets tired and quits. I learned that early. At first, her complaints came in polite little envelopes. My fence line did not match neighborhood standards. My cattle made too much noise in the early morning. The smell from my pasture might negatively affect outdoor recreation. Once, she sent a letter asking whether I would consider replacing my rusty old farm gate with something more visually appropriate. I pinned that one to my refrigerator for 6 months because it made me laugh every time I reached for the butter. Frank would have gotten a kick out of it. He had a way of laughing at trouble before it became trouble, though maybe that was easy for him because he was 6'4" and built like an old fence post. When he was alive, nobody came onto this property without calling first. Not because he threatened people. Frank was not that kind of man. It was because he carried himself like he belonged exactly where he stood and people could feel it. After he died, I learned that some people saw a woman alone on a farm and assumed the land had become softer around the edges. They assumed grief made you easier to move. Marlene especially seemed to believe that. She wanted my east pasture. Not all of it, not officially. Just a strip along the ridge where Briarwood Landing overlooked the creek bottom. She told me the developer's original brochure had called it a shared natural meadow. I told her brochures could call it the Garden of Eden if they wanted, but my deed called it Parcel 7B, and Parcel 7B belonged to me. She said her residents had been promised access to green space. I said they'd been promised houses, not my land. She said I was being difficult. I said that was the nicest thing anybody had called me all week. The problem was, Briarwood Landing had grown restless under her leadership. The neighborhood had a little clubhouse, a small pond, and one patch of grass near the entrance where kids could kick a ball around, but no real gathering space. Marlene had spent most of 1995 talking about a full harvest fair, something wholesome and charming, with apple bobbing, country music, pie contests, and a hayride for the children. She wanted it to put Briarwood Landing on the map, as if the map had been waiting all these years for a subdivision with matching mailboxes to arrive. But the clubhouse lot was too small, and the community pond was too muddy after a wet summer. So she started looking over my fence. She began telling people that the pasture near the creek was common land that had never been properly designated. She used phrases like historical access and community benefit. The truth was simpler. She needed a bigger stage, and she thought a widow with an old farm would be easier to push around than a zoning board or a real estate developer. The first warning I got was a flyer in my mailbox the Thursday before the fair. It had a pumpkin printed in the corner, a little scarecrow, and the words Briarwood Harvest Fair, Centaur, TO 8 p.m., Bring the Whole Family. Near the bottom, in smaller letters, it said location, the Briarwood Meadow beside Larkin's Creek. That was when I knew exactly what Marlene had planned. There was no Briarwood Meadow beside Larkin's Creek. There was my pasture beside Larkin's Creek. I drove over to the Briarwood Clubhouse with the flyer folded in my coat pocket and my county plat map under my arm. Marlene was inside arranging paper napkins into baskets, like she was preparing for a royal wedding instead of a neighborhood potluck. I put the flyer on the table in front of her. "What is this?" I asked. She barely looked up. "The Harvest Fair." "No, I know what it is called. I am asking why you put my pasture on the location line." She sighed the way people sigh when they have already decided you are going to be inconvenient. Then she pulled out one of those glossy developer maps, the kind with tiny trees painted in the margins and smiling families walking dogs where no human being had ever walked. She tapped a green area beside the creek. This was marketed as an open, natural area for Briarwood residents. I laid my county plat beside it. "This is a sales brochure. This is a deed map. One of these matters." Her face tightened. Judith, nobody wants a conflict. Then stay off my land. The community needs room. Buy a room. You cannot keep an entire creek valley to yourself forever." I remember looking at her for a long moment. It was not the words that bothered me most. It was the confidence behind them. The certainty that because she could say something in a firm voice, the world would eventually rearrange itself to suit her. I leaned toward her and said, "Marlene, that land belonged to Frank's father before you were born. It belonged to Frank before you knew this road existed. Now it belongs to me. If you put one folding chair over that fence, I will consider it trespassing." She smiled then, but there was no warmth in it. "We'll see what the county has to say." I walked out of that clubhouse knowing I had not changed her mind. I had only made her more determined to prove she could not be told no. Friday afternoon I checked every gate. I walked the east fence line and counted the posted signs. I made sure the north pasture gate was chained. I called the county clerk, who confirmed what I already knew, that my property line had not moved just because a developer printed a pretty brochure. I called Sheriff Earl McNabb not to make a complaint yet, just to tell him there might be trouble the next day. Earl had known Frank since they were boys. He listened quietly, then said, "Jude, I will keep an ear open. But you know how these things go. If nobody's hurt and everybody starts waving papers, it can turn into a long Saturday." I said, "I know." What I did not say was that I had a feeling it would turn into a longer one than he imagined. Saturday morning, before the sun had burned the fog off the creek, the first cars arrived. By 8 o'clock, there were minivans, pickup trucks, station wagons, an old Winnebago, and that yellow school bus somebody had rented from a church in town. By 9, people had started dragging coolers through my gate. By 10, Marlene was standing on the truck bed with a microphone plugged into a portable speaker, welcoming everyone to a day of family fun in the Briarwood meadow. I watched from the top of my driveway for a few minutes, almost too stunned to move. Then I saw a boy pull one of my no trespassing signs from the fence and use it as a tray under a pie pan. That got me moving. I drove down in Frank's old Ford F-250, the blue one with the dented passenger door and a heater that only worked when it felt like it. 2 young men in orange vests had parked a folding table across my drive. One held up his palm when I pulled close. "Sorry, ma'am," he said. "Event traffic only." I looked at him. He could not have been older than 25. He had a plastic badge pinned to his vest that said, "Briarwood Security." I said, "Honey, you are blocking my driveway." He glanced behind me, then toward the fairgrounds. "This is for the harvest event. You might need to park on the county road." I sat there for a second, then leaned out my window. "Son, this is my driveway." His face changed just a little. Not enough to become embarrassed, but enough to become unsure. "I thought this was part of the common space." "You thought wrong," Marlene said. "Of course she did." I got out of the truck before he could stop me and walked past the table. I could hear banjo music coming from a cassette player near the barn. Somebody was grilling hot dogs beside my water trough. A group of women had set up a pie judging table under the oak tree, where Frank and I had buried our old beagle, Roscoe, 15 years earlier. I saw a little girl in a princess costume feeding handfuls of popcorn to my heifers. I saw a man with a camcorder recording his wife in front of a handmade sign that said, "Fall at the fall of Fee, the Hornell Cord." And I saw Marlene, smiling and waving at people like she had organized the moon landing. I walked straight to her. She looked down from the truck bed and said into the microphone, "Oh, everyone, it appears Mrs. Ralston has joined us." A few people laughed. I will admit, for half a second I wanted to climb right up there and throw that microphone into the creek, but I had spent too many years around livestock to mistake noise for strength. I kept my voice low. "Marlene, tell these people to leave." Her smile stayed in place. "This is a community event, on my land, that is still disputed." "No, it is not disputed. You have just decided to ignore it." She looked over the crowd and lifted the microphone. "Folks, do not worry. We have been assured this area is available for community use." I said, "By who?" She looked at me, and for the first time the smile slipped. "The association has reviewed the matter." "The association does not own my pasture. You are making a scene, Jude." I looked around at the food tables, the buses, the children, the signs, the cars packed to my grass. Then I looked back at her. "Marlene, you made the scene. I just drove into it. I went back to my truck, opened the glove box, and took out Frank's old VHS camcorder. It weighed a ton and had a strap that always twisted around your wrist when it worked. I started recording everything. The broken fence latch, the tents in the pasture, the cars parked over the drainage ditch, the bonfires somebody had started in metal wash tubs, the signs that had been pulled down, the people carrying water from my stock tank. I narrated calmly, the way Frank had taught me to speak when we were documenting storm damage for insurance. Date, time, location, visible damage, names when I knew them. I did not yell. I did not threaten. I filmed. Then I called Sheriff McNabb again. He arrived about 40 minutes later, moving slowly through the traffic because there was hardly room for his cruiser to get down the drive. Earl stepped out, looked around, took off his hat, and rubbed the back of his head. "Well," he said, "looks like Marlene has been busy." Marlene hurried over with a folder under one arm. She had copied that same developer brochure and highlighted the green patch with a yellow marker. She explained that the community had long understood the meadow to be shared space, that the event was peaceful, that I was disrupting families, that nobody wanted conflict. Earl read the papers, then asked me for mine. I handed in the county plat, the deed copy, and the survey markers I had photographed. He studied them for a while, then looked at Marlene. "This appears to be Mrs. Ralston's property." Marlene crossed her arms. "That is a civil dispute." Earl nodded slowly. "It may be. And if it is, a judge will settle it. But I'm telling you right now, Marlene, I do not see anything here that gives the association permission to use this land." "Are you removing everyone?" she asked. Earl looked over the crowd, the children, the food, the vehicles, the folding tables. He knew what I knew. Clearing 200 people in the middle of a packed event could turn ugly fast, especially if every person believed they had been invited somewhere legal. "I'm advising them to leave," he said, "but if they refuse, this may have to be addressed through the court." Marlene heard only the part she wanted. She turned to the crowd and announced that the sheriff had confirmed it was a civil matter. A few people clapped. I watched her climb back onto the truck bed, and that was the moment I stopped feeling insulted and started making a plan. I went home, made a fresh pot of coffee, and sat at my kitchen table until the sun went down. I pulled out Frank's old metal filing cabinet from the hall closet. It still had labels written in his blocky handwriting. TAXES, fence, water, cattle, surveys. I opened the survey drawer and found every map we had ever used, including the one from 1971 when Frank's father had split the original farm between his sons. I found the letter from the developer 20 years earlier asking to buy the creek pasture. I found the rejection Frank had mailed back. I found the county records that showed exactly where Briarwood Landing ended and Ralston Hollow began. Then I opened the cattle folder. Most people who drove past my farm saw black cows and assumed that was the whole story. They did not know those animals. They did not know that I had spent years teaching them routines, moving them through gates, getting them used to feed buckets, whistles, and the same paths through the pasture. I had 21 head that fall, including 4 broad-shouldered Angus cows, 2 old steers, and a bull named Otis who looked mean enough to frighten a grown man, but was really more interested in salt blocks than world domination. The east pasture, the one Marlene had turned into her fairground, sat between the north grazing field and the creek lot, where I planned to move the herd the next morning. I had been putting off that transfer because I did not want to stress the cattle while all the noise was going on. But now I saw the situation clearly. I was not going to chase anybody off my land. I was not going to threaten them. I was going to do exactly what I had planned to do all along. I was going to move my cattle across my own pasture. And before I did it, I was going to make sure every office that mattered knew about it. I called Sheriff McNabb and left a message explaining that I would be conducting a routine livestock transfer at noon the next day. I called the county animal officer. I called the fire marshal about the open flames and dry grass. I called my friend Ray Cordell, who had worked as a surveyor for 30 years and knew my property corners better than some people knew their own birthdays. Ray came out after dark with his old flashlight and stood beside the east fence, shaking his head at the vehicles parked over the line. "You know what their problem is," he said. "They've spent too much time looking at brochures and not enough time looking at dirt." I said, "Can you mark the boundary again for me?" He smiled. "I can mark it in neon orange if that will make them feel better." By 9 that night, I'd copied my deed, the survey map, the sheriff's call log, and a written notice stating that livestock would be moved through the east pasture at noon. I drove to Briarwood Landing and taped the notice to the clubhouse door. I taped another one to the event sign at my gate. I handed one to the young man in the orange vest, who looked like he wished he had chosen a different Saturday job. I did not sleep much that night. Not because I was afraid of what Marlene might do. I was afraid of becoming the kind of person who let bitterness make her reckless. I kept thinking about Frank. He used to say, "Jude, the trick is not winning loud. The trick is winning clean enough that even your enemies know why they lost." Around 3 in the morning, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my shoulders and listened to music drifting across the field from the fairgrounds. Somebody was playing old Garth Brooks songs too loud. I could smell charcoal smoke and cheap beer. The cattle shifted in the north pasture, quiet and patient in the dark. I remember looking at the gate and thinking, tomorrow we are going to find out whether Marlene understands the difference between owning a story and owning the land underneath it. Part 2. The countermove. The next morning came grey and cold for early October, with a thin fog hanging over the creek and dew shining on every fence wire. I made eggs, drank too much coffee, and put on Frank's old canvas work jacket. At 9, Ray arrived with a sack of orange marker flags. At 9:30, my neighbor Cal Monroe pulled up in his flatbed truck with his teenage grandson, Eli. Cal had been helping me with cattle since Frank died. He was 72, wore the same faded John Deere cap every day of his life, and believed most problems could be solved with wire, patience, or a properly timed sarcastic remark. He climbed down from the truck, looked toward the fairgrounds, and said, "Well, Jude, I see the circus stayed overnight." I said, "They did." He looked at Otis through the fence, then back at me. "You planning to move them?" I nodded. Cal grinned a little. That ought to make Sunday interesting. By 10 o'clock, word had reached Briarwood Landing. I could see people gathering near the pasture line, pointing toward the north gate. A few families had already packed up their coolers. Others had moved their vehicles closer to the road, but Marlene was everywhere, walking around with her clipboard and her red windbreaker, telling people there was nothing to worry about, that I was bluffing, that the property association had legal protections, that nobody could force them to leave. I heard her tell one woman, "Mrs. Ralston is trying to intimidate us because she does not want the community to have access to the land." I almost laughed. Intimidate them! I had given them notice, copies of the map, the county records, and the full morning to move themselves and their cars out of the way. The only person who had been intimidating anyone was Marlene, and she had been doing it with a smile. At 11:30, I walked down to the north gate with Cal and Eli. The cattle were waiting behind the fence, heads low, chewing slowly. Otis stood near the back, black hide, damp with morning mist, looking less like a threat than a tired old-school principal. I checked the path one more time. The orange flags ran in a clear line from the north gate, across the east pasture, and down toward the creek lot. There was room for people to stand safely along the far fence if they chose. There was room for cars to leave by the main drive. Nobody had to panic. Nobody had to be in danger. All they had to do was respect the space they were standing in. At 11:45, Sheriff McNabb pulled up again, this time with Deputy Linda Bowers behind him. Linda was small, sharp-eyed, and had the kind of face that made teenage boys suddenly remember their manners. Earl walked over to me. "You got your notices?" he asked. I handed him the folder. He checked the date and time, nodded, and said, "You are within your rights to move your livestock, Jude. We will keep people clear," I said. "That is all I am asking." Marlene came marching toward us before he had finished speaking. Her hair was perfect, which I remember noticing because the rest of the morning felt so strange that something ordinary like hairspray seemed almost insulting. "Sheriff," she said, "you cannot seriously be allowing this." Earl took off his hat again. "Marlene, Mrs. Ralston is moving livestock on her own property." "Through a public event?" "No, ma'am. Through her pasture. We were holding an event without confirmed permission." Marlene pointed at me. "She is doing this to frighten families." I looked at her and said, "Marlene, I am doing this because my cattle need to be moved. You are the one who decided to put a pie contest in the middle of their path." She stepped closer. "You would not dare bring those animals through here." I looked past her at the families gathering near their cars, at the children catching balloons, at the men in orange vests pretending they were still in charge of something, and I looked back at Marlene. "No, I would not dare," I said. I prepared. At noon exactly, I opened the north gate. The first cow came through slow and steady, followed by another, then another. Cal walked on the far side, tapping his stick gently against his boot. Eli carried a bucket of feed and called softly to them the way he had learned from his grandfather. The cattle knew the route. They had moved through that pasture dozens of times before. Still, the crowd reacted as though the Old West had broken loose in front of their potato salad. People began stepping backward. A man dropped a tray of lemonade. Somebody shouted, "Are those bulls?" which was a fair question, though the answer was mostly no. Otis came through near the end, larger than the others, his horns catching the pale sunlight. He did not charge. He did not snort. He walked with the same bored dignity he brought to every task in life, like he had a long list of appointments, and this was merely one stop before lunch. But people saw what they wanted to see. They saw size. They saw horns. They saw the consequence of treating a working pasture like a picnic ground. The noise started small, then grew. Chairs scraped. Children cried. Parents called names. Someone started an engine, then another. A minivan backed into a folding table. A cooler tipped over and rolled down the slight hill, spilling cans of soda into the grass. The band stopped playing in the middle of a song. The young man from security stood beside his table with both hands hanging at his sides, looking like he had just discovered that plastic badges did not come with authority after all. Marlene climbed onto the truck bed again and grabbed the microphone. "Everybody stay calm," she shouted. "There is no need to panic. This is an irresponsible stunt." Her voice shook on the last word. Sheriff McNabb looked up at her. "Ma'am, what is irresponsible is keeping families in a livestock path after being given written notice." She stared at him like he had betrayed her. Maybe in her mind he had. People like Marlene often believe anybody who refuses to take their side has chosen the enemy. The cattle kept moving. Slow. calm, one after another. Their hooves pressed soft prints into the grass where the fair had packed it down. Cal whistled low. Eli shook the feed bucket. I walked behind them, not hurrying, not smiling, not saying a word. And then something happened that I did not expect. A little boy, maybe 7 years old, stood near the fence with his mother. He was crying, not loudly, just the quiet kind that makes a child look embarrassed to be scared. Otis stopped a few feet away, lowered his head, and sniffed the ground. The boy's mother pulled him back. I said gently, "He is not going to hurt you." The boy looked at Otis, then at me. "Is he mad?" I said, "No, sweetheart. He is just trying to get home." The boy nodded slowly. His mother looked at me and I could see something change in her face. Not forgiveness exactly, more like understanding. She had believed she was attending a community fair. Now she was standing on a stranger's farm, watching that stranger move her animals through the only path they had ever known. A few minutes later, that family left. Then another. Then another. By 12:30, the fair was coming apart. Not in a dramatic explosion, not in some wild stampede, but in the ordinary, humiliating way. Bad plans usually fall apart. People packed their cars, they folded their chairs, they gathered their children, they stopped listening to Marlene. And when people stopped listening to someone who built their power on being heard, that is when the real panic begins. Marlene followed Sheriff McNabb around, demanding that he arrest me. She called the livestock movement reckless. She called it a threat. She said I had traumatized children. Earl listened for a while, then said, "Marlene, I have seen more danger in the parking lot outside the county fair. The animals are controlled. The handlers are trained. The property owner gave notice. You are going to need to explain why your association was here in the first place." I will never forget the look on her face. It was not anger anymore. It was fear, not fear of the cattle. Fear that the story had escaped her control. By 1 o'clock, the herd was through the east pasture and safely in the creek lot. Cal shut the south gate. Ely latched it behind him. The field was quiet except for the sound of car doors closing and tires crunching over gravel. I stood near the fence, watching the last of the fairgoers pull away. The grass was torn up. There were paper plates everywhere. Somebody had left a child's jacket hanging from the oak tree. The creek bank had been trampled near the water. It hurt to see it. I would be lying if I said it did not. But underneath the sadness was something else. Relief. Not because people were frightened. I did not enjoy that part. I had not wanted anyone hurt, and nobody was. What I felt relief about was finally being seen. For months, Marlene had treated my boundaries like a personal flaw. She had made me sound selfish for defending what was mine. But now everyone had seen the truth. The pasture was not a community meadow. It was a working farm, and a working farm does not become public just because somebody puts a flyer in a mailbox. The trouble, of course, did not end when the last minivan left. Marlene was too proud for that. Monday morning, I received a letter from an attorney in Kansas City claiming that I had endangered Briarwood residents, caused emotional distress, disrupted a permitted community event, and damaged the association's reputation. I read the letter twice, then set it on the kitchen table and laughed so hard I had to sit down. The nerve of it was almost impressive. But I knew enough not to laugh for long. Frank had taught me that paperwork was serious even when it was foolish. So I called the one lawyer in Larkinsville I trusted, a woman named Helen Crow. Helen was 58, wore square glasses, drove a Buick the color of oatmeal, and had the calmest voice I'd ever heard in my life. She came over that afternoon, sat at my kitchen table, and read every page. When she finished, she took off her glasses and said, "Jude, this is nonsense." I said, "Good." She held up a finger. "Nonsense can still cost money if you treat it casually." Then she smiled a little. Luckily, you did not treat it casually. Over the next 2 weeks, Helen helped me organize everything. The videotape, the date-stamped photographs, the copied notices, the survey maps, the sheriff's incident report, the fire marshal's notes about the open flames, the county health inspector's report about food waste and trash left near the creek, the statement from Ray Cordell confirming the property line, the photos of vehicles parked over my drainage ditch, the letters Marlene had sent over the past 2 years showing that she knew exactly where the fence stood and had repeatedly tried to pressure me into opening the land. Each piece by itself might have seemed small. Together, they told a story no megaphone could cover up. Briarwood Landing started to crack under the weight of it. Families complained about the special assessment Marlene wanted them to pay for legal fees. People who had attended the fair began asking why they had been told the pasture was public. The young man in the orange vest told the sheriff he had been instructed to block my driveway. The woman who had brought the pie table admitted Marlene had told her the farmer had agreed to cooperate. The band leader said he had never been told the site was private. One man, a retired postal worker named Dennis Hart, stood up at a Briarwood meeting and asked Marlene a question that apparently made the whole room go quiet. He said, "If you knew it might be private land, why did you invite our children there?" Marlene answered that she had acted in good faith. Dennis replied, "No, you acted in a hurry." That was the beginning of the end for her, though none of us knew it yet. Part 3. The Reckoning. The hearing was scheduled for the first week of November in the county courthouse. A red brick building with creaky wooden floors and a clock in the hallway that had been running 3 minutes slow since I was a girl. Marlene arrived wearing a navy blue suit and the same expression she had worn the day she first handed me that neighborhood rulebook. Confident. Composed. Certain that presentation could substitute for truth. She had 2 lawyers with her, both from Kansas City, both carrying matching leather briefcases. I came in with Helen, Ray, Cal, and my son David, who had driven down from Columbia after I finally admitted there was a court date. David was 33 then, with Frank's shoulders and my stubbornness, though he would never admit the second part. He had wanted me to sell the farm after Frank died, not because he did not love the land, but because he worried about me being alone. That morning, he held the courthouse door open for me and said, "Mom, you do not have to prove anything to me today." I looked at him and said, "Good, because I am here to prove something to Marlene." He laughed, and for a moment I could see the little boy he used to be, mud on his knees, trying to carry a bucket bigger than his arms. The hearing lasted most of the day. Marlene's lawyers went first. They showed pieces of video from the cattle movement, but they had cut out the notices, the marked path, the sheriff standing nearby, the handlers, everything that made the situation make sense. They described the cattle as aggressive. They called Otis a dangerous bull, which was technically true only in the sense that any animal with horns deserves respect. They said I had used livestock to frighten families off a disputed parcel. They made it sound like I had opened a gate and sent a herd charging into a birthday party. I sat there listening, hands folded in my lap, and I felt that old heat rising again. But Helen touched my arm once, just lightly, and I remembered Frank's words, "Win clean." When it was Helen's turn, she stood up slowly, walked to the table, and placed one thick binder in front of the judge. It was not flashy. It did not need to be. The judge opened it. Helen started with the deed, then the county plat, then the surveyor's statement, then the developer's old letter asking Frank to sell that exact portion of land, proving they knew it belonged to us, then Marlene's own correspondence, including the letter where she had asked me whether I would consider allowing Briarwood residents access to the creek pasture for special events. Helen read that line aloud. Would consider allowing access. Then she paused, looked toward Marlene and said, "That is not the language one uses when one believes land belongs to the association." Marlene shifted in her chair. Helen moved on. She showed the flyer. The footage of my signs, the footage of the block driveway, the video of Marlene announcing the event from the truck bed, the written notices before the cattle movement, the sheriff's report, the fire marshal's report, the health inspector's notes, the photographs of the trash, the footage of people using my stock tank, parking in my field, and walking through the creek bank. Every time Helen turned the page, the room seemed to get quieter. Finally, she played the full VHS tape of the cattle moving through the pasture, not the edited version. The whole thing. You could see Cal guiding them. You could see Eli with the fee bucket. You could see Sheriff McNabb and Deputy Bowers keeping people back. You could hear me telling the little boy that Otis was only trying to get home. You could see Marlene on the truck bed telling everyone not to leave. And then you could see the crowd begin to pack up, not because anyone forced them, but because they realized they had no business staying. When the tape ended, the judge did not speak for a while. He took off his glasses, looked down at the papers, then looked at Marlene. "Mrs. Vickers," he said, "did you have permission from Mrs. Ralston to hold this event on her property?" Marlene opened her mouth. Her lawyer leaned toward her. She looked at him, then back at the judge. "Not in writing." The judge nodded. "Did you have permission verbally?" She hesitated. "We believed." He interrupted her, not loudly, but firmly. "That was not my question. And right there in that old courthouse with the slow clock and the dusty windows, I watched the whole thing collapse. Not with a bang, with one honest answer that she had spent months avoiding. No, she did not have permission. No, the land was not common space. No, the association had not been misled. Marlene had simply decided that what she wanted mattered more than what belonged to someone else. The judge dismissed the claims against me. He ordered the association to cover the cost of repairing the fence, reseeding the damaged pasture, cleaning the creek bank, and reimbursing my legal expenses. He also ordered Briarwood Landing to file a corrected property map with the county and send written notice to every resident clarifying that Ralston Hollow was private land. There were no dramatic gavels, no applause, no television cameras waiting outside, just a quiet courtroom and the sound of papers being gathered. But for me, it felt bigger than any speech could have. Marlene left before I did. She walked quickly, her heels clicking down the hallway, her clipboard tucked under her arm. I watched her go, and I did not feel victorious in the way people imagine. I did not feel like I had crushed someone. Mostly I felt tired and sad that it had taken so much trouble to make one simple point. A boundary is not an insult. A fence is not an invitation to argue. Property rights are not selfish just because somebody else wants what you have. A week later, Briarwood Landing held an emergency meeting. Marlene resigned before the vote to remove her could happen. I heard she stood up, said she'd been unfairly targeted, and walked out while half the room sat silent. Her husband, who had barely appeared during any of this, put their house on the market that winter. By spring, they were gone. I never saw her again. The new association president was a retired school principal named Walter Boone. He came to my house one afternoon in March with 2 board members and a box of pastries from the bakery in town. Walter stood at the bottom of my porch steps and took off his hat. "Mrs. Ralston," he said, "we have handled this badly. We would like to make it right." I looked at the pastries, then at the men standing in their clean shoes on my muddy driveway. "You planning to repair a fence with cinnamon rolls?" Walter smiled. "Only if you insist." They did repair the fence, not just patch it, but replace the broken section with sturdy treated posts and fresh wire. A group of Briarwood residents came out over 2 weekends to pick up trash along the creek. Cal supervised the work like a general. David came down from Columbia with his son, my grandson Luke, who was 5 years old then, and thought every adult man wearing gloves was a cowboy. The people from Briarwood reseeded the torn grass, cleaned the ditch, and hauled away old boards, cups, paper plates, and one mangled plastic scarecrow that somebody had left near the barn. It was awkward at first. Nobody knew what to say to me. Some of them probably expected me to be bitter. Maybe I expected that too. But people are more complicated than one bad Saturday. The woman with the little boy, the one Otis had frightened, came over while we were working by the creek. She introduced herself as Nora. Her son Mason stood behind her, holding a small box of wildflower seeds. She said, "I wanted to apologize. We should have asked questions." I told her, "You were invited. It was not your job to survey the land." She looked toward the pasture. "Still, we should have known better." Then Mason held out the seed box and asked, "Can I put these where the cows walk?" I said, "Not where the cows walk, honey, but I can show you a place where they might grow." We planted the seeds along the edge of the creek that afternoon. Some came up in the spring, some did not. That is how land is. You do your part, and then you wait to see what takes hold. The following October, almost exactly a year after the harvest fair, Walter called and asked whether Briarwood Landing could hold a small community picnic at their clubhouse. I said, "You have a clubhouse, Walter?" He laughed and said, "Yes, Mom, we are learning to appreciate it." I did not attend their picnic. I had work to do. Otis was older by then, slower, and just as uninterested in politics as ever. The cattle grazed in the creek lot. The repaired fence stood straight against the hills. And sometimes, late in the evening, I would sit on the porch with coffee and look toward the ridge where Briarwood Landing's porch lights came on one by one. I did not hate those people, not even Marlene, not in the end. Hate is a heavy thing to carry, and I had enough chores already. But I never forgot what happened. I never forgot how quickly people can convince themselves they are entitled to something when they call it community, progress, access, or the greater good. Those words can mean something beautiful when they are honest. They can also become a polite wrapping paper around plain old greed. I learned something about myself that year too. After Frank died, I spent a long time wondering whether I still belonged on that farm by myself. I thought strength looked like doing everything alone, never asking for help, never letting anyone see me scared. But that was not the lesson. The lesson was that standing your ground does not mean standing lonely. It means knowing what is yours, knowing what matters, gathering the right people around you, and refusing to let someone shame you for protecting it. Sometimes justice is not dramatic. Sometimes it is a county map, a stack of videotapes, a patient lawyer, a sheriff who finally sees the whole picture, and a gate that swings open exactly when it is supposed to. And sometimes, if the person on the other side of that gate has spent too long pretending your pasture belongs to them, the sight of 21 cattle walking calmly home is enough to make the truth impossible to ignore. So I will leave you with this. Was I right to move my cattle that day, knowing it would force the fair to end? Or should I have waited for the court and let strangers keep using my land until a judge made it official? Was Marlene simply protecting her community? Or was she using the word community to take something that was never hers? Tell me what you think in the comments, because I have learned that every town has its own version of Briarwood Landing, every family has its own Marlene Vickers, and every one of us eventually has to decide where the fence belongs and whether we are brave enough to defend it.